So we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you guys are stuck at home, so we so appreciate you continuing to tune in on YouTube as we highlight amazing scientists, explorers, and organizations from around the globe. Today, I'm excited because we are joined by a new speaker on a topic that we've only covered a few times here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Dr. Matthew Ayre is joining us in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and he's going to talk about his role as a climate detective or historical climatologist at the Arctic Institute of North America, where he uses old whaling data, old historical documents to understand ancient climate, older climate, how it's changed over time, and why that's so important, as well as some pretty epic expeditions up to northern Canada. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ayre. Thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Thanks, Jesse. Let me just get my screen shared.
Perfect.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm a climate detective, which means I look at the past climate, and I specifically look at the past Arctic climate. So the Arctic is the area on the top of the planet, the cold bit. Okay, we have two bits of the planet that are really cold. We have the Arctic on the top, and we have the Antarctic on the bottom. Now, the easiest way to remember which is polar bears live in the Arctic, penguins live in the Antarctic. And you never get the two living in the same place unless it's a zoo. But I'm interested in the Arctic, and I'm specifically interested in sea ice, which is frozen sea. And this defines the majority of the Arctic. So these are two what we call polar projection maps. So this is looking at the planet from the top, looking down at the North Pole. And we can see one from March and one from September. And all the white is sea ice, that's frozen sea. And you can see that in March, it's really expansive. And then in September, it shrinks back. And it does this every year. Now, this specific bit of the Arctic I look at is a place called Baffin Bay and the Davis Straits between Greenland and Canada. And you can see in this image, which is from 2019, that in winter, Baffin Bay and Davis Straits is covered in ice. And then summer, it totally disappears. All melts back and it's totally open water. But why is sea ice important? And was it always like that? So this is a video that NASA produces. And this is compiled from observations from space since we first sent satellites up to look at the Arctic. And that was from late 1978. So I'm just going to play this video. And this is the summer minimum. So every September, when the ice reaches its minimum extent, and you can see what's happening in the graph is ever since we've been observing it, there seems to be getting less and less ice when it comes to the end of the melt season. So much so that we predict there may be no ice in the Arctic by 2050 during the summer. Now, this is a problem for all sorts of reasons. One, the polar bears live there and they rely on the ice to survive, as do many of the Arctic animals, as do the people that live in the Arctic. But the Arctic sea ice is really important for the global climate. It affects me, you, everyone on the planet. Because the ice acts like a giant mirror and it reflects radiation from the sun and kind of regulates the Earth's temperature. Now, when there's less ice, we get more heat, which means less ice, which means more heat. Okay, so that's why you see what we call this positive feedback effect and this negative trend. But was it always like this? How can we tell? Here's a glass of water. Did this glass of water have an ice cube in it a week ago? You don't know. I don't know. It's impossible to tell. It's just water. This is kind of like sea ice. Sea ice is just frozen sea. When it melts, it just becomes sea again. So how do you know when the ice was there? That's pretty difficult, unless someone was there and recorded it. So where my detective skills come in is looking at the British Arctic whaling trade. So between 100 and 400 years ago, the only form of oil we had came from marine mammals, and almost exclusively from whales. Whales have these big fat reserves called blubber, and you can render that down, so heat it up, and it turns into oil, and you can use that oil for all sorts. And explorers discovered this big fat whale in the Arctic called the Bowhead Whale. Now, the Bowhead Whale is pretty massive. Okay, you can see a picture of it there compared to an elephant. They can grow over 20 meters in length. And they can have fat over a meter thick. They also happen to be the world's oldest mammal. Right? They can live well over 200 years old. So there are bowheads alive today which still remember the whaling trade, which is crazy to think about. But they were hunted because they're really slow, fat, and when they die, they float. And they were hunted almost exclusively for their blubber and their baleen, which was termed whalebone. Now, the oil could be turned into all sorts. It was used to light street lamps, make candles. It was used to lubricate machinery, treat fabrics, make soap. Imagine washing yourself with some whale soap. It's pretty gross. But the baleen, the plates they feed with, they're made of keratin, same thing as your fingernails. So it's like these giant fingernails in its mouth. And these can be over 4 meters long. So you can see a picture here down at the bottom. This is a dead bowhead whale, which has been harvested off the north coast of Alaska, where they're still eaten by the Inupiat communities up there. And you can separate this baleen out and heat it up, and it's kind of light and flexible. And it's really useful. And it was used almost exclusively in the women's fashion industry to make petticoats and corsets. So it commanded a really high price. Unfortunately, the whaling trade nearly hunted the bowhead to extinction. It wasn't until technology moved on, we unfortunately started hunting other whales, but then technology went past that, and we didn't have to anymore, that they managed to survive. But the sailors that went up there, they would sail up in a boat like a pirate ship, a 3-masted square-rigged boat. And they would keep a logbook. Every boat that goes to sea keeps a logbook, and it records what happens during the day. And it records the weather and the wind, because that's your primary source of propulsion. So you can figure out where you've been, how fast you've been going. But they also record what they see, how many whales they've caught, and whether they saw any icebergs, whether it was raining or snowing, whether they saw any ice. Now, this is where the cool bit comes in. So bowhead whales are filter feeders. They feed on zooplankton. That zooplankton feeds on phytoplankton, so plants, little plants. Those little plants grow on the bottom of the sea ice at its edge. So where you have the edge of the sea ice, you have the zooplankton, you have the bowhead whales, you have the whalers. So if you can find out where the whalers have been when they're recording the ice, you can look at where the ice was in the past. So here are some voyage reconstructions from whaling voyages 200 years ago in the 1820s. So from the east coast of the UK and almost exclusively over to Davis Straits and Baffin Bay. They used to go north up towards Svalbard, which is almost straight north from the UK there. But they almost hunted the whales to extinction there, and everything moved to the Davis Straits and Baffin Bay. Now, this is just 25 voyages. Between 1750 and 1920, there was over 6,000 voyages to hunt whales. Problem is, there's not 6,000 logbooks that exist. They've been lost to time in history. People have thrown them away. Not everyone keeps them, but some people have, and they've ended up in museums around the world. So part of my job is going around the world and finding out where these are. So I found them in America, I found them in Canada, I found them in the UK. But out of these 6,000 voyages, I've managed to find only 130. So really not many. But you can see them here. They're quite hard to read. So rather than spending all my time in the archives going through them, I take photos of them. So I'll go in, I'll take loads of photos for maybe a week, and then I'll come back to my office here in Calgary and start going through them. You can see on this one, there's a picture of a whale tail. That's the day they caught a whale. Just a really quick measure to see when they caught a whale. So let's have a closer look at one. And what information does it include? So this is from the 1828 voyage, sorry, of the ship Dorden from a place called Hull on the east coast of England, which was a massive whaling port at one point. It's from Thursday, July 10th. And then you can see the first column, or the second column, sorry, that's wind direction. So that first one there says south, then it changes to south-southwest, then west-southwest. Then we go through it and it says 4-part, light airs and thick. Light airs is how strong the wind is, and thick is what the weather's like. So that's kind of muggy and humid. Then it says, at 2 p.m., made sail and plied to windward along the land ice, several ships in company. So now we know that we're going along ice. Not only just ice, this is land ice. This is sea ice, which is frozen to the coast. Now that's pretty important to the people that live in the Arctic because it's like the highway in winter. Okay? And that's melting faster than it ever has before. So now we know that they're going along the land ice and they were with several other ships. That's good to know if you have another logbook from the same year, because they might be in the same place at the same time. Then you can check they're recording the right thing. Because if they're in the same place at the same time and they say the same thing, you can be fairly confident in the observations. Then we go on, it says, at 5, saw a fish. Now they're not talking about a fish, they're talking about a whale here. Okay? And they knew they were mammals, but they still called them fish. It's kind of weird. Sent 2 away, at 4, returned without success. At 9, saw 2 fish. Sent 6 boats away. At 11, took up the boats without success. So they saw some whales, but they didn't catch them this time. Then it says, middle and latter part, more clear. Ship dodging at the ice, distance from the land about 35 or 40 miles. Latitude by account, 73 degrees, 33 minutes north. So now we know where they are. And if we know where they are, and we know that we're ice, we can plot that there was ice there. Oh. So this is where they were on the 10th of July, 1828, off the northwest coast of Greenland. Okay, now this is just a Google Earth image, so it doesn't show ice. But you don't get ice at this time of year anymore. Okay, but now we know. We not only know that there was ice there, we know that they saw whales there, so we can map that and look at where the whale distribution was. We know what the wind was like, and we know what the weather was like. But there's also some really weird things that you find reading these logbooks, because you have to transcribe them by hand. So you have to read them, and you have to type it in to a spreadsheet. You can't get a computer to read them for you. So when you're reading them, you find all sorts of crazy stories. So this one says, had a cat hunt at night, got 3. The crofters watched the men with suspicion going about with bags and hampers, thinking it was hens instead of cats they wanted. So they just left port in Scotland. They'd stopped off at a nearby island on their way to the Arctic, and they decided they needed some cats for the ship to take care of the rats. So they went and stole 3 cats from the crofters, which are like small farmers on the island. I know, it's kind of crazy. But also, you can see things, you read things which lead to massive adventures. So this one was from a 1902 logbook that said, one of the Nova Zembla's ship's boats came alongside and reported to us that the Nova Zembla was ashore a little to the south. When I read this in 2018, it led to 2 Arctic expeditions to go find the Nova Zembla with my colleague, Dr. Michael Maloney, who did a talk with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants a few weeks ago, and you can find that on the YouTube channel. But you can see there's me and Mike with the hull of the ship up on the coast of Baffin Island. So these things are super interesting, which makes me want to read more, being able to do things like this. So what about comparing to today's conditions? So here is a logbook entry from the 18th of September, 1891. Now, the 18th of September last year happened to be the sea ice minimum in the Arctic. And as you can see from the image on the left, there is no ice in Baffin Bay. When we read this account from 1891, 129 years ago, it says, this bit I've highlighted, says, steamed up to the fast flow at the north side of Eglinton, which was a natural harbour on Baffin Island, and hooked onto the fast ice about 15 miles, that says of, but it's a misspelling of off. So 15 miles offshore, they've still got land fast ice, 129 years ago. Now, that doesn't happen anymore. So sometime between then and now, that ice has stopped being persistent. It's pretty interesting. Why don't, if we look back a bit further, what you can see is how the ice changes month to month. So the whalers would leave in about late March, early April to sail to the Arctic. And they'd reach the ice just as it was starting to melt. And they'd spend the whole time on the ice edge all the way through to September, October, when it starts to freeze again. And then they'd come home. Otherwise, they'd get stuck. So if you look, so these are ice observations for the 1820s in July, August, and September. So if you take all the observations the whalers made in July for the 1820s, observations of ice, and plot them, and then you compare that to the modern average, you start to see a difference. So the blue line is the modern average. So the average ice edge between 1981 and 2010. Okay, and that's derived from the satellite images we showed earlier. So you can see in July that the orange dots, the whaling observations, are closer to the coast of Greenland, where the blue line is further out into Baffin Bay. Then we get to August and the blue line disappears. That's because there's no sea ice on average in Baffin Bay now. But there's still loads of orange dots. Oh, my cat is biting my arm. And then you go to September, where there definitely shouldn't be any sea ice, certainly today, and there's still orange dots. So by looking through these logbooks, we can see that the ice 100 to 200 years ago was still present in Baffin Bay. Now these observations can feed into models to make them more accurate to predict how the changes are going to be in the future. So I think I'm going to stop there. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Well, before we go back to see you and you can end your screen share, everyone who's online can check that out, see those that webpage and your email address. So if you guys have more questions for Dr. Ayre at the end of the presentation, you can email him there. But yeah, come on back. And that was fantastic. We've never had so much righteous indignation against the cat thefts in any of our programs. So thank you for that story. Everyone's very angry on behalf of the farmers and for the cats. For our groups tuning in on YouTube, please do share where you guys are joining from, and we'll take as many questions as we can. I want to kick off, Dr. Ayre, by asking, how do you get into this? Like, this is the neatest job, going around the world looking for these, historical documents. What prompted this? Was there something that inspired this when you were younger, or did you get into this once you were in university? Tell us a little bit about your story.
I grew up on the coast of northeast England in an old whaling port. Was always really interested in history. It was all I used to sail, interested in the sea. Then I went to university to do geography and got really interested in climate change. And then one day, one of my lecturers said, "We've got this project. We think we can use whaling logbooks to look at past Arctic climate. Are you interested?" So I said yes. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster since then.
Fantastic. Again, if you want to come out of screen share so we can see you, that would be awesome. Done, no hurry. Yeah. Sophia, who's 9, wants to know, what is your favorite whale? Maybe from this historical document searching, or just in general? You have one that really jumps out?
Well, I really like the Bowhead Whale because I read so much about it. And I was lucky enough to see them for the first time in 2018. So that picture I ended on with that sunset, that was the first time I ever saw a bowhead whale, which was pretty cool. But I kind of really like narwhals with that big long tusk. I haven't seen one yet, but I keep going to the Arctic and trying. So
one day.
the whaling logbooks refer to them as the unicorns.
Which they are. I mean, there's trendy videos on YouTube and everything about unicorns of the ocean. So that's fantastic. Speaking of whales, so you're on a whaling vessel and you've gone, and this is not like a modern day gigantic metal ship. These are wooden ships. And so how do you get a whale back from Greenland or Nunavut back to the UK?
So you don't bring the whole whale back. This is kind of gross. So they lower their little boats, they chase a whale, they catch it and kill it. They tow it back to the ship. Then they peel it. Like you'd peel an orange. You peel the skin and the fat off. They cut the tail off and use the tail as a chopping block because it wouldn't blunt the knives. And they'd cut the blubber into little cubes. And they call that process making off. And then they put it in wooden casks in the hold of the ship, where they're stored until they're taken back to the UK and then boiled to make oil.
Gross, but you're clearly very entranced in this whole process. Now, the lingo here, so this is something in your presentation and in that little description there. How long did it take you to learn all these terms that are in these whaling books to understand what they mean? You mentioned fish or whales, and I mean, it must take a while.
Quite a long time, yeah. It takes a while just to get used to the writing and learn to read it. It's almost like learning to read again. Some of the language is different, and then obviously there's the whaling specific terms as well. Yeah. But I've been reading these for nearly 10 years now. So you get used to it, I guess, and you pick up things along the way, but you almost get used to the way they talk. And it's kind of like you're there. It's cool.
Very cool. I have linked in the YouTube chat bar to all the students. Mike Maloney is your colleague's presentation that you mentioned. So if everyone wants to check that out when they're done, I really encourage you to do that. They're like a perfect complement to one another, these presentations. So do check that out. All right, in Miss Ricardo's class joining us on YouTube, Santino wants to know how much ice goes away over the last decade. So you were showing images of ice loss over the last 120 years, and you were talking about this and you're seeking out this data. On a decade by decade basis for students that might only be 10 years old, how much have we lost?
Loads.
Yeah.
Millions of square kilometers.
Yeah.
And it's thinning too. So the Arctic ice used to be really thick as well in the Arctic, and that would help it survive through the summer. But now it's getting thinner and thinner, which means it can melt readily.
So, which is a negative story, and something that a lot of students now know in classes really instinctually is climate change, what it's doing to the Arctic and the sea ice. So on a bit of a positive turn from that with whales in general, one of the questions from Mr. Ricardo's class is, Emily wanted to know, how many whales are left? So again, you talk about all these whaling voyages, and now we don't hunt whales for their oil, at least most countries don't. So have whales made a comeback? Are they getting better? What's the deal with them?
Yes. So the bowhead was nearly hunted to extinction, and that's because it lives a really long time. So it takes a long time to reproduce. Okay? It's almost like humans. So they have to wait until they're 15, 20 years old before they can have a baby.
Yep.
But now, since we've stopped, the populations are starting to rebound, and in some areas, they're no longer endangered, which is great.
It's one of the more positive conservation stories in the last 50 years is the commercial ban on whaling. But Jennifer wants to know, are there any countries that still hunt whales, or is it still legal in anywhere or not?
Yeah, so there are indigenous communities that still hunt whales in Canada and in the US, and in some parts of the tropics as well. But in Canada, bowheads, belugas, and narwhal are all eaten. I've tried narwhal and I've tried bowhead when I've been in the Arctic. Yeah. Bowhead tastes better than narwhal. Both don't taste that great. It's definitely an acquired taste. But they're really small numbers, and that's something that's been happening for thousands of years. So there's no problem with that. Commercial whaling, that's where the problem is. There are still a few countries that do bits of commercial whaling. So there's Norway, and there's Iceland, and Japan does whaling under scientific purposes.
Right.
These are limited to a few species which are not classed as endangered, but there's still a lot of lobbying to ban whaling completely.
Yeah. I'm really glad you made that distinction between commercial versus subsistence hunting. This is something that comes up in a lot in our presentations, is this idea of hunting as a conservation tool or hunting as something that is inherently bad. And I think that when you highlight that something has been done for thousands of years by communities there and not made a dent in the population, this is not something that we need to worry about, Arctic subsistence hunting. Commercial whaling was the issue. And again, on a world scale, this has gone down so drastically that a lot of whale numbers are bouncing back, which is really great. All right, Sophia also wants to know, what is the rarest whale? So is there any that are still really in trouble that we need to be thinking about?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know. The bowhead's pretty rare in some places in the Arctic still.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the rarest whale is. I can look that up for you though.
Okay. If you want to share with us, and again, for the students, they can check back on a YouTube video and email you those questions directly if they're keen, or pass them to us at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Lots of ways to get your answers to questions we might not cover today. Dr. Ayre, you talked about finding this amazing story of the Nova Zembla in your whaling logs and then launching an expedition to go there. Do you have other expeditions planned, either back to the same site or to different sites in the Arctic?
Yeah. So I kind of look at the logbooks in a new light now, because I come across all sorts of wrecks and graves and harbors and things the whalers left behind, which haven't been found. So we were planning to go back to Nova Zembla this summer, but obviously that's all cancelled now. Right. So we're going to go back next summer. Yeah. There's another wreck around the corner, which another logbook made me aware of about 3 weeks after we got back last year. Yeah. And then there's a couple of wrecks off Greenland I really want to go back. I find it fascinating to go to the Arctic, especially as I spend all this time reading about it through the eyes of these sailors. Because when I go, I can recognize all these the land bearings they give. So when they say they're at Button Point or Cape York, and I go there, I can see it, it makes it a lot more real. And right. I can make a visual direct comparison with the data I see in the logbooks. So
this is so neat, and something that outside of the realm of everyday experience for our students is thinking of these places as places. I mean, the Arctic in Canada is so vast, and it's such a huge part of Canada. I think it's over a third of the landmass in Canada, if not more than that. And yet, for most people, they might never get a chance to go there. And so that's why expeditions like this and sharing that work for the public is so important, because it's so neat to see. So another note for all our students, in addition to, again, Dr. Maloney's presentation, so Dr. Ayre's colleague, we're also doing another marine archaeology program in the coming week, I think the 27th of May. So we're excited about that. And for students at home, if you guys want to look up, in fact, I might ask you this as a question, sort of the biggest marine archaeology expedition in the last many years that sort of caught the public attention was the Erebus and the Terror in the Arctic. Could you explain a little bit about that for people who might be keen to look it up?
So HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were part of John Franklin's search for the Northwest Passage, which in the 1840s got lost. And people have been searching for them ever since. And it was only until very recently that they were found in Canada, and the wrecks are really well preserved. It's one of the biggest Arctic mysteries. So it's pretty cool.
Is pretty cool. I encourage everyone to check out Erebus and Terror. Parks Canada's marine archaeology team is looking that up, and we've partnered with them in the past. So do check that out. A question for me personally. So you said that you go around the world looking for these log books, and again, you found a lot, but a small proportion of all those that are to be found. Are there places that you're seeking to go to, not necessarily this year, but in the coming years? Are there places that might have some of these in storage or in their archives that you could check out?
So I go back to Scotland quite a lot. So I grew up pretty close to Scotland, just south on the northeast coast of England. And there's still people that crop up that were related to whalers who happen to have a logbook. Cool. So I try and get back there quite often. There's one archive left that has a bunch of logbooks I need to go to in Cambridge. That's the Scott Polar Research Institute. Yeah. Other than that, I've pretty much exhausted, I think, everywhere. Which is good and bad, but there's a whole other set of logbooks that cover the world's oceans.
Yeah.
So with the Hudson Bay Company logbooks.
Yeah.
So they've been used in past climate studies. Royal Navy logbooks, they cover across the world.
Yep.
What else have we got? There's the East India Company, which used to trade from London to India.
You're not running out of work anytime soon, is the moral to the story.
There are hundreds of thousands of logbooks, yeah.
Yeah, which is so fantastic. I mean, this is something that is, again, outside of the realm of everyday experience for our students when you think of a lot of transport and trade being done by truck, by plane, by whatever. But for most of the world's history, whether it was trade or hunting of animals or what have you, this all took place in a maritime setting on the sea. And so these logbooks are history writ large, not just for whaling, but for anything you might want to find out, which is why you're clearly so passionate about it. It's very cool. So, Dr. Ayre, before we wrap up, we're getting surprisingly close to the end of the session. If someone wanted to do this for a living, like if someone wanted to be you, how would they go about doing that? Is there a path to that, or follow your passion?
Be curious. So, be curious about everything. Everything's interconnected. So, I look at history and climate change. They could be seen as separate subjects, but they're really not. They're really quite intertwined. Yep. To become a researcher, you're going to have to go to university. Do something that you find interesting. I did geography, and loads of it's really interesting, but some of it's really boring. It really just depends on what you're interested in.
Yeah. And
then you're going to need to go and do a PhD. Then you have to be really interested, because it's the only thing you're going to look at for like 4 or 5 years of your life. But once you do that,
well, that's the thing though. But if you are like, if you follow that passion through to a PhD, which I think is, if you work it out grade wise, is like grade 16, 18, it's like grade 22. So for our students in grade 3, a ways ahead of you, but you get to go on expeditions all over the world in pursuit of awesome historical data, and then go find ancient lost shipwrecks in the Arctic. It's very cool. So
it's pretty cool. I didn't ever see myself doing this. So.
Fantastic. You said, I love this question as a wrap up, and it's something that we dive into a lot in our programs. Jennifer wants to know online, what can kids that are watching home today do about the loss of sea ice? So to help curb climate change, because this ultimately is where your interest stemmed from. So what can we do at home?
Make green choices. So if you've got a reusable water bottle, use that. Yep. Can you walk to school? Could you take your bike? Or if you can't, can you use public transport? We have to curb our use of fossil fuels, so gas and coal and oil. So anything you can do, and you can make those choices to do that. So if the weather's good, go to school. But if it's not, you can still use your car. Don't worry about it.
I love this. And this is something that we come up with in all of our programs. And I think it ultimately boils down to don't waste, whether it's marine plastic or climate change or protecting biodiversity. Don't waste food, don't waste plastic, don't use single-use plastics if you can avoid it. Walk or use public transit or a bike if you can. All these things really do go a long way. If everyone who's watching in on these programs does this, you'll make a real big difference. This has been fantastic, Dr. Ayre. Before we wrap up and I sort of end the broadcast, I do want to note for everyone tuning in, speaking of conservation, this weekend coming, so Friday through Sunday, we are launching our first ever Global Biodiversity Festival. So 50 programs, 3 days, all in support of 6 amazing conservation organizations. So free to watch, but we're running it as a fundraiser. And we really encourage you to check that out. With that said, Dr. Ayre, thank you so much for joining us today. This is so cool. And, as you can tell by the relentless smile on my face, it's a topic that I'm fascinated with, and really appreciate you sharing your story today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. To all our students joining in on YouTube, thanks so much for watching. And do check out Matt's colleague, Dr. Maloney, on YouTube as well. I encourage you to do that. And for now, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now.